What's wrong with relationships?
Even the nuclear family that a lot of us believe in today isn't what the nuclear family used to be or should be.
What you're actually aiming for in a relationship isn't really happiness.
Well, that is actually what defines whether or not you are a whole person. Because if you can't handle negotiating with somebody else, then you actually aren't capable of experiencing the full fruits of a relationship like that.
Welcome back to Adventure Nut, and today the yellow couch isn't my only guest. I'd like to introduce you to Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jeff.
My name is Jeff.
So I'm a student in psychology, and I'm currently studying to get my master's in counseling to specifically practice in marriage and family therapy.
Awesome. And so today, the reason I actually wanted you on is I've been wanting to do a video for a while about relationships and kind of some of the trends that I've observed recently over, I guess, my life. And I thought maybe you would be a good person to bring on and talk about this because you do have some experience in this. What's wrong with relationships? What's everything wrong with relationships in a nutshell?
Well, I think today a lot of people don't even know what their role in marriage is supposed to be. In high school, kids are like looking to their parents to try to be examples for them. And then they see a lot of popular culture representations of it, where there's kind of like a bumbling dad who's kind of an idiot, who doesn't really know what he's supposed to be doing in the marriage. There's usually the wife, often in a lot of popular media, who has everything figured out, has always things under control. And even in a lot of therapeutic contexts, you kind of see this representation expressed in a lot of clients where fathers really don't know how to connect with their family. They don't understand the emotions that their kids experience. They don't understand where their wife is coming from or her desires and wants. And then the wife doesn't understand in a sense, the simple desires of the husband because he's often kind of a simpleton. But that simplicity often seems more like a neglect or absence to the people around the father, and his simple desires are often inadequate to actually contribute to the family at large. But a lot of people are leaving out this relational aspect where it's actually a really negotiated thing that we need to do.
Well, first of all, I got to say, like, the wife that seems like she has it together and the guy that's just kind of bumbling around, I do feel like that in my own relationship a lot of times. Just to be fair, there's a level of reality to that. I think that people have this idea that I want to be in a relationship, and relationships are primarily about finding the right person. And then once I find the right person, then everything else is going to just kind of naturally fall into place. I feel like too much effort is put onto the correct choice of person rather than realizing that everybody has their flaws and you can kind of work up to a good relationship. People kind of take what they're going into the relationship with as the sum of its parts. And so they think that they can't have a successful relationship until both people outside of that have everything figured out.
Well, the reality is a lot of people, like you were saying, they expect both parties to come to a relationship fully figured out and fully refined as a human being. But the problem there is only in relationship do you actually get to see the depths of your own flaws, right? Because they're not going to come to the surface outside of that circumstance. So when you're on your own, you're not actually going to have any opportunity to experience your flaws in their full extent. But when somebody else who is looking at you and saying, I want to love you and I want to build a future with you, they're going to look at you more critically than you've probably ever been looked at before. Because they're closer to you, they get to see every single negative thing rise to the surface, and it's going to happen. And a lot of people, once that starts to happen and you no longer have those hyper infatuated feelings about that person that kind of happen at the beginning when you're first attracted to them, you think they're super good looking or you really like their personality, and that kind of covers up all those flaws. But over time, you're not going to have that rose-colored glasses anymore, and you're going to get to see that person for who they really are. And well, the crux of the issue is what happens when that process begins and you start seeing the flaws rise to the surface. Well, that is actually what defines whether or not you are a whole person. Because if you can't handle negotiating with somebody else, then you actually aren't capable of experiencing the full fruits of a relationship like that, because you're not willing to undergo the process that is in part painful of healing from your own inadequacies, because we are all, as individuals, inadequate when we first come to a relationship. It is that relationship which then brings out something greater in us to strive to be something better, both for that person and the relationship as a whole.
Where do you think that a lot of the cynicism comes from relationships? Because I feel like every time I watch a video about relationships, so many of the comments are like, this is why I'm never getting married, or I've been with my partner 20 years. I'm not going to get married to them because I don't want to have this. Like, why do you think people have shifted so much to that? And do you think that the idea of marriage that people have, or even relationships, has to change as just the culture changes, and like maybe we're striving towards something that is no longer feasible?
Well, I think you raise a good point that maybe we aren't even realizing a good model of marriage at the general level for most people. And in truth, I would say even the nuclear family that a lot of us believe in today isn't what the nuclear family used to be or should be, because we kind of idealize that model. But if we misperceive what it is in the first place, then we don't even know where to start to actually start building a good relationship. So if you actually look back historically, the idea that man is provider, woman is caretaker, they have those extremely rigid, solidified roles that they carry out day to day. It actually hasn't always been the case. The majority of peasants across time were farmers. The wife was actually a farmer too. She wasn't just sitting around watching the husband work the fields day to day. She was maintaining crops, she was harvesting, she was milling things. They were both completely engaged in this process of production. And we think that as industrialization came into being, that well, now the man, he's got to leave the house and go to work, and the mother's going to be a stay-at-home mom who takes care of the kids and make sure everything's clean. Well, peasants weren't doing that. Rather than just, you have your individualized duties, you have your individualized duties, they don't cross, they don't mix. That is not a realistic view, and that's not a view that humans have had throughout most of human history. We actually have somewhat variable roles that we can take on in marriages and within the family with regard to children, that you need to have a little bit of flexibility in what your expectations are for one another. If you go into a relationship thinking, I want a stay-at-home wife that will do exactly as I expect of them, then you're actually somewhat delusional about what humans have done throughout most of history. It has only been since industrialization that kind of relationship has even been possible.
So with that context, would you say that it's reasonable to say that like the failure for more, let's say, conservative minded people in relationships is to be too rigidly dependent on like gender roles, and then the failure of the more liberal minded types is where they're so independent from each other that they actually don't have a shared relationship?
Conservatism is often viewed as a rigid mindset, and you don't really want a lot of flexibility in your expectations with conservatism, because you're conserving what you had before, right? And then liberalism is always finding new ways and new lines to cross and new things to do. Well, the reality is in any healthy relationship, you're going to have a mix of those two aspects. You're not just going to be liberalizing in your relationship. You're not just going to be conserving your expectations of a relationship. You're going to be looking at it in a very flexible way, seeing how it can fluidly adapt to the circumstances that your relationship faces to then accommodate the needs of each individual. Because the reality is having a rigid boundary against what role each person should be playing will actually make it difficult for them to then change their role when somebody else is no longer capable of fulfilling the role to their fullest extent. I'm not saying that you can't have, to some extent, roles that each person partakes in, but we need to move away from this idea that there's just one way of engaging in your role as father or mother or child, because you actually have a diverse array of things that you can do depending on the circumstances that occur, to contribute to the well-being of each individual in the family. And if you can't change and modify what is required of your role, a lot of people are going to end up struggling a lot because they're not going to be able to meet the needs of each person in the family to actually be flourishing today.
It seems like when I go online and I see people talking about dating and all that kind of thing, there's a lot of cynicism around dating. Like there's a lot of people that kind of have this view that getting married nowadays is kind of maybe pointless, or that it's a trap or not really a requirement. And then even when people do get involved into relationships, it kind of seems like they are maybe going into it for the wrong reasons, or maybe have incorrect views about what like being in a relationship and marriage is.
Yeah, I would say there's definitely some major things to consider that have been trends in the overall perception of marriage. I think in the culture has influenced people a lot. In the past, we used to have a more collective view of marriage where when you get married, it's not about how I'm going to be fulfilled by this or how this relationship is going to add to me necessarily. It's going to be how do I contribute to society at large through my marriage, and by then potentially having children and actually creating a unit that contributes to society overall. Whereas a lot of people, when they're getting married, they're more focused on how does this add to me? How does this add to my individual identity? When in reality, it's how do you add your individual identity to a broader structure? It's no longer viewed as something that we're actually participating in. We often view it as something for our own individual fulfillment. People want somebody that's kind of a perfect partner for them, so they date many different people over time, and they're told, well, find what works for you. But the reality is you're never going to find a perfect person in the modern world. You just might find somebody you work relatively well with. And marriage is actually a constant process of negotiation, kind of understanding how you are different and how you can work together to overcome those differences. And it's a cooperation over time. So a lot of people aren't ready to engage in that, and they actually have a relatively narcissistic view of what a relationship should be to them. A lot of people kind of view marriage now as two work partners working on something, like as individuals, whereas the previous perspective to our modern day view would have been everybody who gets married would get married in the local community or town church. Since they witnessed your marriage, hold you accountable to being properly engaged in that marriage. And there isn't the same levels of privacy during those times that we experience now, because we can all experience our own individual life. They would have been communally engaged. So the community would see their relationship in action all the time, and then they would participate as that relationship in that community. So both their interaction with the community, they would have to act more communally for their marriage, and they would also have to experience the community's pressures to engage in their roles appropriately. The reality is marriage is not about dominating or controlling another person or having somebody that slots into this specific role. It's about a deeper self-sacrifice where you actively start to consider the other person as part of your own experience. You consider their wants as part of your own subset of wants, where you both start looking at your needs and desires in life as unified. And you don't consider their needs unimportant. You consider them co-equal with your own.
One thing that it seems to me is that in the past, people had, generally speaking, more equal experiences to the people that lived around them compared to nowadays. Like if you're living in a village and you have like a blacksmith and a merchant and like a carpenter, and you're all living in like a village, realistically none of you have particularly different lives. But I think nowadays, because people do have such individuated lives, the constants of a model for marriage isn't even there. If you look historically at marriage, like let's say in royal families, that would have been very different compared to the average peasant family living there. And so, but that didn't matter, because this modeled idea of what the royal marriage looks like versus the peasant life. If you're a peasant, you're not seeing that royal marriage where like you don't ever really see your partner and they're primarily there for strategic reasons. But now with social media, we're constantly having these relationships modeled for us that might not be in any way equivalent to the relationships that the average person can realistically have. Like, the amount of Instagram couples out there where they're both like CEOs and they work out 3 times a day and they're both like these attractive people living in LA. That's not the vast majority of people. The vast majority of people are kind of normal, so to speak. And so there's this expectation of what the relationship needs to look like, but it's completely divorced from what the average relationship actually looks like.
Historically speaking, the average person was like a peasant or like some just average worker who would have no means of actually even seeing those high level noble marriages. So they wouldn't see any examples or models of marriage outside of their own community and have direct experience from the people that they know in their own relationships. Whereas today, even looking back at history, we don't really even think about the marriages of the peasantry or the average people. We only really think about marriages when it comes to the upper classes, like the nobility. People talk about how marriage used to be about arranging alliances and resources and all that kind of stuff. But that was actually only occurring at the upper crust of society. The majority of marriages were between people who were in what we would consider extreme poverty. They just didn't have the finances, or necessarily they didn't even own anything to have that kind of lineage or those big expressive marriages. So we look back at that time and we look to our own time, and the majority of examples of marriage that we today see are at that very high level of society. People aren't really interested in, oh, this peasant married this peasant girl. Nobody cares about that history really, because that seems benign. It seems irrelevant. We want to personally associate with those who had influence, had power, but often those are the very people who are some of the worst examples of what marriage can be and should be.
Yeah. And I think not only do people not have, like, they have these kind of, I guess, upper class marriages and relationships really modeled to them, but even to the people around them, a lot of our exposure and experience of other people's relationships is also through social media, which is, the appearance of that is controlled by the poster, right? Like you might interact with your friends maybe once a week, sometimes less, but then your exposure to their relationship is through their social media. And so you don't even have a realistic sense of what people hypothetically on your level have, let alone people that are experiencing lives way beyond you. How many people can genuinely relate to like Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce's relationship? One's an NFL superstar, and the other one is one of the most profitable musicians that's ever lived. And neither of them are risking a whole lot with this relationship, because if the relationship falls apart, there's a long line of people right behind them to pick it up, so to speak. And they neither of them really need the other person. Like, they are both completely independent to the point where the requirement to build something mutual together is just straight up not there. You're not going to see that level of mutual reliance in that relationship because they don't need the reliance.
Well, that's a really interesting observation. The majority of marriages today, the research is actually coming out that if you're when it comes to conflict or figuring out things for the future, it's not one person deciding exactly what's going to be happening and how it's going to get done. The most successful marriages are those that kind of take a collaborative approach, not to put this in a negative connotation, but they're codependent on each other to build one another up and help each other flourish in their own distinct areas. So a lot of the time we're told today in our individualistic culture that you need to be independent and be able to sustain yourself and be able to afford everything that you yourself want in life. But that has actually never really been that realistic. In the past century, maybe we had a short time where that was an actual situation where you alone could sustain everything you want in life. But throughout most of history, people were completely reliant on each other, on their communities, on their spouses, and even a lot of the time on their children to keep things going and running efficiently so that everybody has what they need to make it through the next day even. And today, when our society maybe seems a little bit more chaotic and unstable. Realistically, one of the things that might be a bit of an antidote to that, as it has been throughout time, is marriage and spousal relationships, where they are specifically trying to focus on being collaborative and building one another up to then actually face the pressures that they have from society, financially or otherwise, to then overcome those as a unit or a group of people and a pillar in their own community. Individually, we are actually capable of a lot less. Marriage, I think, might actually find a way back to a prior representation of it, because if we can focus on this collaborative aspect of it more and represent that in the culture more, then that actually might draw people back to seeing how it can actually help them through their own personal challenges, while at the same time enable them to have value and meaning in helping another person. Marriage is really about interdependence, not personal fulfillment. We are all interdependent people. We rely on other people, whether or not we like it or not, to make it through life every single day. None of civilization would be here if there wasn't a massive society-wide community constantly maintaining everything around us. So if you think you can make it through on your own at a relational level, you're actually not living in the real world. I think marriage is actually one of the most real world things and real world solutions to overcoming our own individual inadequacies. Today, while marriage may be devalued in a lot of ways, I think it's actually becoming more valued to those who are experiencing the fullness of it.
One thing I think I hear a lot that I also think I want to touch on a little bit is that they say marriage is just a piece of paper. Like, what do you think about that argument or that statement?
That's just a piece of paper?
Yeah.
Well, if that's the approach you're taking to marriage, then I don't think you're ready to get married. Because you don't view it as the relationship that is something more. You just see it as a legal contract forcing you to be with another person, or at least holding you accountable to that other person. And, well, I think a lot of people who view it that way are some of the major contributors to the massively growing divorce rates that we see. If you see it that this marriage is forcing me to be stuck with this person, I can see how you'd easily get the mindset that, well, if I can just get rid of this piece of paper, then I can have somebody better, somebody more enjoyable, somebody more fun. Reality is we're all going to grow old. We're all going to get ugly. We're all going to die. Are you going to spend your life constantly switching out people to maybe get lucky? Because truth is, it's kind of a lottery getting the perfect person. It's like maybe 1 in a million chance. So find somebody that you're willing to commit yourself to every day. Somebody that it's not that piece of paper holding you to them. It's your whole view of them as a person and yourself as a person, building something together that's more than just you and that person. If you don't actually think it's more than just a piece of paper, you're not going to be capable of contributing to making it something more than just two individuals deciding to live together and be roommates.
I think it's interesting because a number of times in this conversation you've talked about how like marriage isn't a static thing, it's a dynamic thing. And I think maybe that ties into this idea of selecting the perfect person, because people assume that the relationship is going to continue on to be whatever it started with. And I think maybe if you have that understanding that a relationship is dynamic over time and it has its ups and downs, then that is kind of an interesting idea of how to approach relationships, even from like a dating perspective, because you might meet somebody that's great now and then in 30 years maybe they're not. But then the opposite is also the true, where you meet them now and they don't have much to offer, but they're really willing to work on it. And then as you move towards something, then they become that ideal partner for you. Oftentimes I see people, at least in our particular area and culture, where they get married so young and it's like, I don't know if this is great. Like, you don't seem like real adults yet. But I do think like one good thing about getting married young is you aren't fully developed into a specific person yet. And so you kind of grow up into something that's more favorable to work with your partner, and vice versa. Like, I think I'm glad I kind of got married before I was like fully done developing as a person, because I do think it made me a much better person now, because I kind of had to develop into this thing to work in the environment of my relationship. Whereas, with a lot of people now, when they're getting married in their 30s, or maybe even later, and then trying to start a family, you're already so established in your habits and your ways of thought that now you are going to have more of that static situation because it's not as dynamic anymore. And then the relationship will still try to force that dynamic change, but now you're so set in your ways that there's not a lot of room there for compromise and movement. And I think that's kind of the one tragic thing, is a lot of people, they don't want to get married young. They want to wait until they're older to commit themselves to a long-term serious relationship. Like, there's this whole cultural idea now that when you're young you have fun casual relationships, and then when you're old you get serious. But I think the problem with that is you're not the same person after all those casual relationships that you would have otherwise been if you had just approached the relationship from the beginning with a more serious intention. Because now you've had your fun, and now every relationship you have is boring, and you're going to compare them to all the past relationships you've had. And then also those past relationships don't necessarily model what your future relationship is. So now you have this kind of expectation of a fun, uncommitted relationship. And now that you're trying to do it for real, you're kind of trained against yourself. You're habituated against yourself.
This expectation has been developed in the culture today that you kind of figure out who you are and then connect with somebody else and try to build a life with them. But like we've been talking about, a lot of what marriage is realizing where you fall short, and then through conversation and relational dynamics, you resolve that and actually, in a sense, heal those flaws that have come up through your past experiences. And if you go into a relationship saying, I'm not going to change, or I'm not expecting myself to be open to change, then you're actually not ready for a relationship, because a relationship is either going to make you change or it's not going to work out well. Because if you do not change, then you're not adapting to both who that person is and the circumstances that come up in life that require different roles for you to take on and require you to act in different ways than you're used to. Because you actually need to take on various roles to survive in this constantly changing and chaotic world that we're in. If you can't adapt and you can't change, then you're going to struggle, and you're actually going to be a greater detriment to your relationships than you would have been otherwise. Because if you're not willing to change and you're just trying to force change onto them, then that can have its own set of issues. If you want a real marriage and you want to have a fulfilling life, seek somebody who's going to be your partner in your individual growth. Don't think, I need to reach my full maturity to then be ready for a relationship. Because the reality is you're never going to be at a static point of, I'm finally mature, I've figured everything out. If you think that, you're actually probably falling into some narcissistic tendencies. Nobody has it figured out. The world is always changing. Tomorrow is not going to be the same as today. Know that you're going to have to adapt and change for the rest of your life, and find somebody that you're willing to go through that process with and acknowledge their inadequacies, your inadequacies, and grow with one another to overcome them.
I think that's words of wisdom for everyone at all times right there. Well, I think this has been a really interesting conversation. We'll have to do it another time. You've just watched Couch Conversations. I just named this series right now. And I've been Adventure Nut. This is my buddy Jeff, and we're gonna probably do some more of these depending on time, because he's a busy man. So we'll hope to see you guys in the near future. I hope you enjoyed this kind of different format, and we'll see you all around.
Take care now.
Take care.